The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as Daniel pushed his mop across the polished marble floors of Sterling Enterprises, a towering glass skyscraper in the heart of the city. The building was alive of energy during the day, filled with executives in tailored suits, interns hustling with coffee orders, and managers darting between meetings. But by the time Daniel began his shift in the late afternoons, the atmosphere shifted. The noise died down, the echo of hurried footsteps faded, and only a few late workers remained, typing behind glowing computer screens. For most, Daniel was invisible. People passed him in the hallways without acknowledgement, their eyes fixed on glowing phone screens or the next deadline. At best, someone might mumble a distracted, "Thanks," as he emptied their office bin. But usually they didn't say anything at all. And Daniel didn't complain. He was used to being unseen. At 42, his life looked far different from the dreams he once had. There had been a time years ago when he'd believed his name might one day appear in bold letters on a concert program or an album cover. He'd studied piano passionately in his youth, pouring his soul into each note, imagining himself on great stages. But life, unpredictable and merciless, had its own plans. When his wife Maria fell ill, everything changed. The hospital bills grew faster than his savings could handle, and eventually music became a luxury he could no longer afford. When she passed away, Daniel was left with a 5-year-old daughter, Lily, and a mountain of responsibilities. His hands, once meant for gliding across piano keys, were now calloused from scrubbing floors, fixing broken faucets, and working late night shifts just to keep food on the table. Yet, despite the exhaustion, despite the quiet grief that lingered in his heart, Daniel found joy in small, hidden places. He'd hum lullabies while cleaning the stairwells. Sometimes, when no one was around, he'd stop by the gleaming black grand piano in the lobby. More decoration than instrument. And press down a single key, letting the note linger in the empty air. It reminded him of who he once was, of the boy who dreamed of filling concert halls with music. But he never played more than a few seconds. He didn't want to draw attention. After all, he was just the janitor. His coworkers, though most never truly saw him, sometimes joked behind his back, "That guy's always humming," one receptionist laughed once. "Maybe he thinks he's auditioning for The Voice." Another chimed in, "He should stick to cleaning. That's his real talent." Daniel overheard these comments more often than people realized, but he kept his head down. He wasn't bitter, he just knew people judged quickly when they only saw a uniform and a mop. What kept him going was Lily. Every morning, before he left for his shift, she'd hug him tightly and say, "Good night, Daddy. Don't forget to dream big." She was only 8 now. But she spoke like someone who'd seen more of life than her years should allow. In her eyes, Daniel wasn't invisible. He was a hero. The one who showed up at every school recital, who helped her with math homework at the kitchen table, who made pancakes shaped like hearts on Saturdays. She didn't see the mop or the tattered eyes, she saw her dad. And that was enough. Still, at times, when Daniel was alone in the lobby, polishing the marble floors under the soft golden glow of the chandelier, he'd glance at the grand piano sitting silently in the corner. It was a Steinway, easily worth more than he made in a year. He imagined what it would sound like if he could let his fingers dance across the keys again. If he could fill the cavernous lobby with something beautiful instead of the sterile silence. He'd stand there for a moment, lost in thought, until the squeak of his cleaning cart snapped him back to reality. Then he'd sigh, pick up his mop and return to work. There was a quiet dignity in the way Daniel carried himself. He never asked for pity, never complained about long hours. He treated everyone with kindness, even when they ignored him. He remembered people's names, asked about their families and held open doors, but few noticed. To them, he was background noise, someone they expected to always be there, blending into the marble and glass. Yet beneath the surface was a man filled with stories, memories and music that still lived in his bones. His life had been about sacrifice, but his heart still carried a spark, a small flame that refused to go out. And though Daniel didn't know it yet, that flame, that hidden music, was to be revealed in the most unexpected way. Because sometimes, the world only needs one moment to finally see the people it has overlooked. It was a Friday afternoon at Sterling Enterprises, and the lobby buzzed with unusual energy. The week had ended early for many employees, and those who remained gathered near the grand piano in the corner of the vast atrium. The company was celebrating the close of a big deal, and the air was lighter than usual, full of laughter, chatter, and the clinking of coffee mugs raised in an impromptu toast. Daniel, as always, was working in the background. He pushed his cleaning cart toward the far wall, trying to stay out of the way. Moments like this always made him feel more invisible than usual. He could hear their conversations, snippets about weekend trips, brunch reservations, and new cars. A world so far from his own that it felt like eavesdropping on another planet. The grand piano stood at the center of it all, polished and pristine. More sculpture than instrument. For years, Daniel had walked past it, resisting the ache in his chest that begged him to sit and play. He'd never once seen anyone touch it. It was like a trophy. A symbol of elegance that belonged to the building, not to the people who worked inside. But today, a group of younger employees circled around it, one of them leaning against the glossy lid. A man in a slim blue suit, probably no older than 25, nudged his coworker and smirked. "Hey, you know who should play?" he said lightly enough for the lobby to hear. "The janitor. I've seen him staring at this thing for years." Laughter rippled through the group. Another chimed in, "Yeah, come on man. Show us what you've got. Can you play chopsticks at least?" Daniel froze mid-step. He felt all eyes turning toward him. His mop squeaked against the marble, suddenly deafening in the silence that followed. He wanted to disappear. It wasn't the first time people had made jokes at his expense, but this one cut deeper. The piano was sacred to him. They didn't know that, of course. To them, it was just harmless teasing, a way to lighten the mood. But to Daniel, it felt like someone had pulled a curtain aside and exposed the most vulnerable part of him. He looked at the faces staring at him, some curious, others smirking. He could hear the receptionist whisper to a coworker, "This'll be good," followed by a stifled giggle. For a moment, Daniel considered shaking his head, laughing it off, and walking away. He was used to swallowing his pride. It would have been easier to just continue mopping, to remind himself that he was here to work, not to be entertained at someone's expense. But something inside him shifted. Maybe it was the long years of silence, of hiding the music in his heart. Maybe it was the memory of Lily's voice that morning when she'd hug him goodbye. "Don't forget to dream big, Daddy." Whatever it was, Daniel surprised even himself when he slowly set the mop aside and walked toward the piano. The group erupted in whoops and laughter, as though they'd successfully pulled off some office prank. "Here we go," one of them cheered, clapping. Another whispered, "This is gonna be hilarious." Daniel lowered himself onto the bench. The polished wood felt cool beneath his hands. He stared at the ivory keys, his reflection faintly visible in their surface. His fingers hovered uncertainly, trembling slightly. It had been so long since he had truly played. And now he was expected to do it in front of people who weren't expecting music at all. Only a joke. He took a deep breath. The noise around him blurred into a dull hum. For a moment, all he could hear was his own heartbeat, steady and strong. He remembered the nights long ago when he and Maria had sat by the piano in their small apartment, her leaning against the side, eyes closed, as he played her favorite melodies. He remembered the lullabies he had composed for Lee as a toddler, her tiny hands trying to mimic his movements on the keys. And then he remembered the silence after Maria passed, how the piano lid had stayed cold for years, how dust had gathered where music once lived. Now, sitting here, Daniel realized he had a choice. He could play a few clumsy notes, confirm everyone's low expectations, and retreat back into the shadows. Or he could tell his story. Not with words but with music. A hush settled over the crowd as Daniel finally pressed down the first key. A single note rang out, pure and resonant, echoing through the lobby like a bell. Some of the employees chuckled nervously, expecting him to stumble. But Daniel didn't stumble. His other hand joined in, then both hands moved together, and suddenly, the piano came alive. The laughter stopped. The melody was soft at first, almost like a whisper. But there was something in it. Something raw, something undeniably human. Each note carried weight, like a confession spoken aloud for the first time. The sound filled the marble lobby, wrapping itself around everyone present, demanding their attention. Daniel didn't look up. He didn't care about the smirks or the stares anymore. He was somewhere else. Somewhere between the past and the present, between grief and hope. His fingers moved with muscle memory, pouring out years of hidden pain and unspoken love. The employees stood frozen. The receptionist who had giggled earlier now had her hand covering her mouth. The young man in the blue suit lowered his gaze, suddenly uncomfortable. What they had intended as a joke was unraveling before their eyes, transforming into something they hadn't expected. Truth. From the mezzanine above, a few more employees gathered, drawn by the sound. Among them was a tall man in a gray suit, standing with his hands clasped behind his back. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on Daniel. None of them knew it yet, but that man was the CO. And as the music rose, weaving grief with beauty, exhaustion with hope, Daniel was no longer just the janitor. He was the man who held the room captive with nothing more than his heart and a piano. The cruel joke had become something else entirely. The spark that would change everything. The first note lingered in the air, vibrating gently against the marble walls of the Sterling Enterprises lobby. What had started as a cruel joke was now reshaping itself into something almost sacred. Daniel's fingers, roughened from years of scrubbing floors and handling cleaning supplies, glided over the ivory keys with an elegance that silenced every whisper in the room. At first, the employees didn't quite know how to react. They had expected a clumsy attempt at chopsticks, or some childish nursery rhyme. But instead, what they heard was something rich, layered, alive with emotion. The melody began simply, like a tentative confession, then built into chords that resonated deep in the chest, bypassing the mind and going straight to the heart. The lobby transformed. The same space that usually echoed with hurried footsteps and shallow conversations now felt like a cathedral. Every note Daniel played filled the air with something intangible yet undeniable. Sorrow intertwined with hope, exhaustion wrapped in resilience. Grief slowly unfolding into beauty. Daniel wasn't just playing music, he was telling his story. He thought of Maria. Her soft smile when he played for her late at night. The way she would close her eyes and rest her head on his shoulder. As though his music was the safest place in the world. He thought of the hospital rooms where he had sat by her bed, silently praying for more time. Wishing he could play away her pain. He thought of her funeral, where the piano stayed silent, because his grief was too heavy for his hands to lift the lid. And then he thought of Lily. His daughter, the reason he kept waking up every day despite the crushing weight of responsibility. She had never truly heard him play. Not like this. She had heard fragments, lullabies hummed in the kitchen, improvised tunes tapped out on the cracked keys of a second-hand keyboard. But this was the fullness of what lived inside him, released at last. His fingers moved faster now, the melody rising like a tide. Every phrase carried years of silence, years of being unseen, years of being just the janitor. The music was raw, imperfect in places, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the truth in it, the vulnerability it demanded. The employees who had been smirking moments before now stood completely still. Some held their breath, afraid that even the sound of exhaling might disturb the fragile beauty of the moment. The receptionist's eyes glistened with tears. She tried to blink away. The young man in the blue suit, who had been the first to suggest Daniel play, shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado now replaced with a weight of shame. From the mezzanine above, more people leaned over the railing, drawn by the unexpected music. The sound carried through the building, up stairwells and down corridors, pulling listeners like a magnet. The CEO, who had arrived unnoticed, remained by the railing, his sharp, analytical mind momentarily silenced. For years, he had prided himself on recognizing talent in all forms. The clever intern with big ideas, the sharp executive who could close impossible deals. But as he listened to Daniel play, he realized how blind he too had been. This man who swept his hallways and mopped his floors, was carrying a gift powerful enough to stop time. And yet, Daniel wasn't thinking of any of them. He wasn't performing for applause or recognition. He was lost inside the music, lost inside the memories and the emotions he had bottled up for so long. Each note felt like a release, a weight lifted. He played as though the piano were the only place he could truly speak. The melody shifted again, softening, becoming tender, almost like a lullaby. The audience didn't know it, but this part was for Lily. Daniel's heart poured into every gentle phrase, his promises to protect her, his prayers that she would grow up strong, his longing to give her a life brighter than his own. The final passage came like a sigh. His hand slowed, the notes spacing out like words spoken carefully, deliberately, until at last the final chord rang out, resonant and warm. Daniel let it linger, his fingers resting on the keys as the sound faded into silence. For a long moment no one moved. The employees who had gathered stood rooted in place, stunned into stillness. They weren't just surprised, they were humbled. The joke they had started had turned into a revelation. They had expected a janitor fumbling on the keys, but what they got was a man bearing his soul in the only language that had never left him. Daniel finally lifted his hands from the piano and let them rest in his lap. He bowed his head, not daring to look at anyone. For him, it wasn't about the audience. It was about release, about remembering who he was beneath the uniform and the mob. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, came a sound, not laughter, not whispers, but applause. It started slowly, hesitantly, then grew louder, spreading through the lobby like a wave. People clapped not because they had to, but because they couldn't not. They clapped because something inside them had been moved, awakened, touched in a way they hadn't expected on an ordinary Friday afternoon. Daniel looked up, startled, his eyes wide. He had braced himself for ridicule, for smirks and dismissive comments. He hadn't braced himself for this. And as the applause filled the air, he noticed something he never expected to see: the CEO himself, standing at the railing above, his expression unreadable, except for the unmistakable shimmer of tears in his eyes. For the first time in years, Daniel was no longer invisible. He was seen, he was heard. And everything was about to change. From his vantage point on the mezzanine, Richard Sterling, CEO of Sterling Enterprises, remained frozen as the last notes of Dane Foreman's faded into silence. The applause roared through the lobby, bouncing off the glass walls, but Richard didn't clap. He couldn't. His hands were gripped tightly together, his chest heavy, his throat tight in a way he hadn't felt in years. The people around him, executives, assistants, managers, were clapping enthusiastically, some even whistling, others dabbing discreetly at their eyes. But Richard's gaze never wavered from the man at the piano. The janitor. The one he'd passed 100 times in the hallways without a second thought. For Richard, it wasn't just beautiful music. It was something far deeper. Something personal. The melody had peeled back layers he had carefully built around himself, layers of steel, ambition and control. As Daniel played, Richard had seen flashes of his own life, the long nights alone in his office, the family dinners he'd missed, the strained relationship with his own daughter, now grown and distant. And most of all, he thought of his wife, Elaine, who had passed away 5 years earlier. She had been the one who kept music alive in their home, the one who played piano in the evenings when he was too busy chasing deals to notice. She used to tease him, saying, "One day, Rich, you'll realize life isn't just about building empires. It's about building moments." Listening to Daniel's music was like hearing Elaine's voice again. It was as if she was whispering to him through the notes, reminding him of what he had lost, and what he had ignored. The grief he had buried deep came rushing to the surface, unstoppable. Without realizing it, tears welled in his eyes and spilled over. He quickly turned his face away, embarrassed that anyone might see the powerful CEO in such a vulnerable state. But it was too late. A nearby assistant glanced at him, eyes widening in shock, then respectfully looked away. The sight of Richard Sterling with tears streaming down his face was as rare as snow in July. Down below, Daniel sat at the piano bench, still unsure of what to do. He hadn't expected applause. He certainly hadn't expected silence so profound it felt like reverence. For years, he had trained himself to fade into the background, to be unnoticeable. Now all eyes were fixed on him, and it felt overwhelming. Then, slowly, Richard descended the stairs. The applause softened as employees noticed him making his way down, their attention shifting from Daniel to their CEO. The air changed. Reverence replaced by nervous anticipation. What would the CEO say? Would he scold them all for turning the lobby into a stage? Would he dismiss the janitors playing as a distraction from real work? Richard's footsteps echoed against the marble, steady and deliberate. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, red and moist, betrayed the storm inside him. Daniel lowered his gaze, ready for reprimand. Maybe he had crossed a line. Maybe sitting at that piano had been a mistake. He swallowed hard, preparing himself for the words he feared were coming. But instead, Richard stopped right in front of him. For a long moment, he said nothing. The lobby was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Then, Richard extended his hand. Daniel hesitated, confused. Slowly he reached out and shook it. Richard's grip was firm, but his voice, when he finally spoke, was soft and raw. "That." Richard paused, his throat tightening again. "That was extraordinary." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Employees exchanged surprised glances. Their CEO, a man known for his cool detachment and relentless pursuit of results, was visibly moved. Richard cleared his throat, trying to steady himself, but his voice broke again. You didn't just play music, you told a story. And I heard every word. Daniel blinked rapidly, stunned. He opened his mouth but couldn't find any words. His entire life, people had overlooked him, dismissed him, labeled him by his job. Now, the most powerful man in the building was standing before him with tears in his eyes. Richard turned to the crowd, his voice growing stronger. Let this be a lesson to all of us. We walk these halls every day, blind to the people around us. We reduce them to titles, to uniforms, to roles. But every person has a story, a gift, a brilliance waiting to be seen. And today, we've been given the privilege to see his. He motioned toward Daniel. The employees clapped again, this time louder, fuller, not just out of awe but out of respect. Daniel's face flushed, he wanted to shrink into himself. But there was no hiding now. The applause wasn't mocking this time. It was genuine. Richard looked back at him, his expression softening. What's your name? Daniel, he said quietly, almost whispering. Richard nodded. Daniel, I'll never forget this moment. And I don't think anyone here will either. The words landed with weight, not just for Daniel but for everyone present. The young man in the blue suit, who had first mocked him, lowered his head in shame, realizing the cruelty of his earlier joke. The receptionist wiped at her eyes openly now, no longer hiding her tears. Even the employees on the mezzanine above clapped with sincerity, their expressions humbled. For Daniel, the moment was surreal. He wasn't used to recognition. He wasn't used to being seen as more than the janitor. And yet, here he was, standing in the center of the lobby. Handshaken by the CEO himself, surrounded by applause that wasn't for the man who mopped floors. That for the musician who had finally let his heart be heard. Richard, still visibly emotional, placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. I don't know how you've been hiding this gift all these years, he said, voice thick. But I promise you this. You won't be invisible anymore. For Daniel, those words pierced deeper than the applause. It wasn't about opportunity or praise, it was about dignity. About being seen not as a background character, but as a man with worth. And as the crowd continued to applaud, as Richard stood beside him, something shifted inside Daniel. For the first time in years he didn't feel invisible. He felt whole. What began as a joke had turned into a revelation. Not just for the employees who had underestimated him. But for the CEO who had rediscovered his own humanity through Daniel's music. It was a moment that none of them would ever forget. And it was only the beginning. The applause slowly faded into a warm hum of murmurs, but the energy in the lobby of Sterling Enterprises lingered like the last note of a beautiful song. People were reluctant to leave, as though they knew they had witnessed something rare. A moment that would become legend in the building, retold for years to come. Daniel sat still at the piano bench, his hands resting lightly on the keys. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. His heart pounded, not from nerves anymore, but from the overwhelming surge of emotions coursing through him. Just an hour earlier, he had been invisible. Another shift to get through before heading home to his daughter. Now, somehow, he was the center of something extraordinary. Richard Sterling, the CEO, remained beside him, his hand still on Daniel's shoulder. The tears on his cheeks had dried, but the sincerity in his eyes had not faded. He turned to the crowd again. This man reminded us of something we forget too often. Richard said, his voice steady but carrying a tremor of emotion. That greatness isn't measured by titles or paychecks. Sometimes, the greatest among the ones we overlook. The lobby erupted in applause once more, but this time, Daniel found himself standing. He gave a small humble nod, his throat tight. He wanted to speak, but words felt so inadequate compared to what he had just expressed through music. Still, he managed to whisper, "Thank you." The employees began to disperse, many stopping to shake his hand or offer words of admiration. That was incredible. You made me cry. I'll never forget this. Each comment left Daniel a little more stunned, a little more aware that his life had shifted in ways he couldn't yet grasp. Later that evening, as the building quieted and Daniel prepared to finish his janitorial rounds, Richard approached him again privately. "Daniel," he said, his tone now softer, almost paternal. "Do you have any idea what you've done today?" Daniel shrugged awkwardly, unsure how to answer. "I just played." Richard shook his head. "No. You didn't just play. You gave us something we didn't know we needed. You reminded us of our humanity. You made this building feel alive in a way spreadsheets and reports never could." Daniel lowered his gaze, embarrassed. "I've always loved music," he admitted quietly. But life it got in the way. I had to choose responsibility over dreams. Richard studied him for a moment. Then, with unusual gentleness he asked, "Do you still dream, Daniel?" The question caught him off guard. No one had asked him that in years. He thought of Lily, of the way she told him every morning to dream big. Slowly, he nodded. "Yes, I still do." The Richard smiled, the kind of smile that revealed not the CEO, but the man behind the title. "Then it's time you started living those dreams again. Not just for yourself, but for everyone who needs to hear what you carry inside you." The conversation ended with a handshake. But the promise in Richard's words lingered long after. The days that followed felt surreal. Word of Daniel's performance spread quickly through the company. People who had once walked past him without acknowledgement now greeted him warmly, stopping to chat, asking about his music. Some even begged him to play again during lunch breaks. For the first time in years Daniel felt seen. But the change wasn't just in how others treated him. It was in how he saw himself. That flame inside him, once dim, now burned brighter. He began practicing again, sneaking into the lobby after hours when his cleaning duties were finished. The piano, once a silent decoration, became his refuge. His music filled the empty halls late into the night, carrying stories only he could tell. At home, Lily noticed the difference immediately. "You're smiling more, Daddy," she said one evening as they ate dinner. Daniel chuckled, ruffling her hair. "Maybe that's because I'm remembering who I am." One Saturday morning, he brought her to the building, showing her the grand piano in the lobby. "Want to hear something?" he asked. Her eyes lit up. "Yes." As he played for her, really played, not just fragments, Lily sat cross-legged on the marble floor, her face glowing with pride. "I didn't know you were that good," she exclaimed when he finished. Daniel laughed, tears stinging his eyes. "I guess I forgot too." A month later, Sterling Enterprises hosted a charity gala. Instead of hiring a professional musician, Richard insisted on something different. When the evening arrived, guests in elegant attire gathered in the same lobby where Daniel once felt invisible. The lights were softer, the atmosphere warm. But the centerpiece was the grand piano. When Richard took the stage to welcome everyone, he told the story of the janitor who had been asked to play as a joke, and how his music had moved an entire company, including its CEO, to tears. Then, with pride, he introduced Daniel. The applause thundered as Daniel walked to the piano. He felt nervous, but as he looked out into the crowd, he saw Lily sitting in the front row beside Richard, her face beaming. That was all he needed. When he played, the music soared higher than ever before. It wasn't just about grief or hardship anymore. It was about hope, resilience, and love. Each note carried not just his story, but the reminder that beauty could rise even from the darkest places. By the final chord, people were on their feet. Some wiped tears. Others clapped until their hands ached. And Daniel, the janitor, the single father, the man who had once been invisible, stood in the spotlight. No longer overlooked but celebrated for the gift he had always carried. In the weeks that followed, opportunities began to open. Local community centers asked him to play at events. A church invited him to lead music one Sunday. Someone suggested starting a fundraiser to support his daughter's education. For Daniel, it wasn't fame or fortune that mattered. It was the dignity of being valued for who he truly was. But the greatest reward came from Lily. One night, as he tucked her into bed, she hugged him tightly and whispered, "Daddy, you're my hero." Daniel kissed her forehead, his heart swelling. "No, sweetheart. You're the reason I'm still standing. You're the real hero." The world outside didn't change overnight. Daniel still cleaned floors. Still carried his mop and bucket. But now, he walked with his head a little higher, his step a little lighter. Because he knew that no matter what uniform he wore, no matter what others saw on the surface, he was more than his job. He was a father, he was a musician. He was proof that sometimes, the most extraordinary stories come from the people we least expect. And it all began with a single note, played not as a joke, but as a truth that made even the CEO tear up.